January 13th, 1995. Mary Catherine Edwards, a beloved teacher. She had just gotten off work and spent the evening picking up her dog, Maggie, from her twin sister's house. She went to go get some Italian food, then did her Bible study at home. Later on, around 8 p.m., Catherine calls Allison, and they have a casual chat. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for a recent argument with her ex-boyfriend. They also had made plans to meet up at the movies the next day around 4 p.m. That night, in her quiet townhome on Park Meadow, a man staying next door with a neighbor heard strange noises. It was late, 1 or 2 a.m. Thumps echoed through the wall. At first, it sounded stationary. Then it sounded like someone walking upstairs. Then came rapid movement, someone rushing down the stairs. Moments later, he heard a car speed away, its loud music fading into the night. Another neighbor, sharing a different wall, was also awakened. He and his wife heard thudding sounds against the wall, but no screams, no cries for help. They chose to ignore it. The next day, January 14th, Catherine's family grew worried when they couldn't reach her. She never missed a call and would never miss their family lunch plans. By noon, they're anxious, and by the early afternoon, her parents and sister decide they better go check on her. Using a spare key, they enter her townhome. At first, when they entered, everything downstairs seemed fine. Maggie, her dog, is downstairs. But upstairs in the bathroom, they find Catherine. Her body is slumped in the bathtub, water pooling around her lifeless, cold body. She was wearing only a t-shirt and nude from the waist down. Her hands cruelly cuffed behind her back. And welcome to Shall We Brew? I'm your host, Haley. I came across this case late last week while preparing for today's episode. Initially, I'd planned to cover a different story. But as I began looking at the details, I realized this episode would coincide with the 30th anniversary of her passing. It felt fitting to share her story on this significant day. While I wouldn't necessarily call it a sign, I just couldn't ignore the feeling that her story deserves to be heard, especially today. So if you're listening to this Tuesday, January 14th, it marks 30 years since Mary Catherine Edwards' life was tragically taken. And just a trigger warning for today, we'll be talking heavily about SA during this episode. So it's important that you take care of yourself, and please skip this one if you need to. So with that being said, let's get started. Mary Catherine Edwards, who mainly went by Catherine, and her twin sister Allison Ann Edwards were born in July of 1963. The twins grew up on a state drive in Beaumont, Texas, in a home filled with love and laughter. The music from Broadway musicals such as Cabaret, Music Man, and Mame were constantly played on the record player. Magic shows and impromptu dances were a regular at family gatherings. Catherine and Allison's mother loved Halloween, and she would always dress up as a witch, decorate the house, pass out candy. Their house was the house all the neighborhood kids would play at. They had a really good friend they met during their teen years, Diana. And Diana says that they were both just really sweet, funny, and everyone just loved them. Diana became friends with them after she moved to Beaumont, not knowing a single person. They started talking to Diana by asking her name, and she says they have been friends ever since. The twins' father was a third generation continuing a family tradition by joining the family firm, selling both real estate and insurance. Their mother co-hosted a local talk show in 1973, and in 1983, she became the director of volunteer services at a local hospital. So, needless to say, Mary Catherine and Allison Ann grew up in what sounds like an amazing childhood home. Catherine and Allison were extremely close, and they were each other's best friends. After graduating from Lamar University, the sisters decided to work as school teachers in Beaumont, Texas. Catherine was a fifth grade teacher at Price Elementary. She would call the students her kids. The twins would always talk every night before bed after they no longer lived together once Allison was married. A lot of people in their circle would say you really couldn't tell them apart from each other. In fact, they looked so similar, one year their yearbook photos were switched. Sometimes their students would see one of them in the store, and the kids would call out, "Miss Edwards, Miss Edwards." And then the sisters would just go along with it and make sure that they acknowledged the students. They wouldn't ever correct them. Allison states that Catherine was always very nurturing and loving towards people. She would talk to strangers, or if anyone ever had a problem, they would always come to her for help. She would compliment people and make friends. She was just an amazing person, but she was extremely trusting of people, even a little naive. Catherine would walk her dog alone at night, and Allison would tell her that's not a good idea. Or she would do things like read a book in the park by herself, and her sister would be like, "Catherine, that's a horrible idea. That's not safe." By 1995, Allison had children, so she took time off from teaching and would watch Maggie, Catherine's dog, every day. So when Catherine worked, she would drop Maggie off in the morning and then pick her up in the afternoon around 4 when she got off. The Edwards had a tradition of getting together every Saturday to have lunch and just visit with each other. Allison had a 9-month-old baby girl, and Catherine loved and adored her. So they would always try their best to get together and make sure that they spent time with one another. On Saturday, January 14th, Allison gets up, and before doing her normal routine, she calls Catherine first thing. She just wants to touch base about lunch and the movie later. And Catherine doesn't answer. So at first, Allison, she doesn't think much of it. Maybe she went to the bathroom, or maybe she was outside with her dog and just didn't hear the phone ring. Allison continued to call her over and over, leaving Catherine message after message. "Hey, Catherine, where are you? Call me back. I'm worried about you. Where are you?" Normally, Catherine is pretty good about checking her answering machine and calling people back. So Allison knew this was abnormal and had a really unsettling feeling. She goes to her parents' house where her brother and both parents are. They ended up just getting McDonald's for lunch, and they talk about how they can't get a hold of Catherine. Their dad was always very protective of his daughters and had always worried about them, but especially Catherine because she lived alone. So he went to go check out St. Andrew's Church. They thought she would be helping their cooking and usually didn't finish until around noon. But he was unable to find her there. Their mother, Mary Ann, and the father, Lon, want to go check on Catherine at her house. So Allison hands over the key to her parents, and all the Edwards children go back to their homes. And this is when Catherine's parents found her in her home. They had found her upstairs in the bathroom. She had been raped, handcuffed behind her back, her body slumped down in the bathtub, sideways with her face down. The bathtub is filled with about 4 to 5 inches of water. Her mother, Mary Ann, calls 911.
What's going on, man? Man, I can't understand. What? I can't understand what's going on. What's this address, dear? It's 911. my daughter. What did you all do? He's been murdered. Your daughter's been murdered?
Her father, Lum, when he sees Catherine's body slumped, he grabs her and hugs her, then lays her body on the ground and covers her with a towel. During the investigation, they find 36 bruises all over Catherine's body, so it looked like she had put up a fight. A rape kit had been done. They took fingernail clippings and swabs from her body. Stains were found on Catherine's comforter, which was then swabbed for DNA. Pair of handcuffs that were used were Smith & Wesson brand, which is a pair of police-grade handcuffs. So it's not a pair that just anyone would have lying around. There's no sign of forced entry. Initially, they thought she had drowned, but the evidence showed that there was not enough fluid in her lungs. Then they say the cause of death was suffocation by compression. The handcuffs, though, they are a big piece of evidence, and the immediate thought is it law enforcement? Could it be somebody we know? However, they run the serial number located on the cuffs, and the search comes up empty. Just as a little side note, most law enforcement agencies do maintain an internal inventory system where the serial numbers of handcuffs are recorded for tracking and accountability purposes. This is especially important for evidence management in a case a handcuff is used during an arrest. The police start looking at ex-boyfriends. They believe the perpetrator was someone she knew, someone that Catherine would possibly let into her house, since there was no sign of forced entry. They look into David Perry, which is the ex that she had an argument with the same week she was found deceased. But this really doesn't lead them anywhere. David had been out of town the same time of the incident. And he also gave his DNA sample, and it did not come back a match. And unfortunately, the case remained unsolved for several years. But the Beaumont Police Department did well at preserving the evidence and the DNA over the years. By 2018, there was now a way to take the DNA evidence and search for biological relatives. The program, GEDmatch, it takes up all the DNA from people who agree to share it with law enforcement once they upload it to sites like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and MyHeritage. In April of 2020, the cold case detective sends the DNA from Catherine's crime scene to Othram Forensic Lab just outside of Houston, Texas, for testing. The forensic lab would then start giving law enforcement familial matches, and from there, they start trying to build a family tree to narrow down the suspect. The site GEDmatch specifically has a program called Genetic Witness. After you upload your DNA, the police can then see how you might be related to the unknown suspect they're trying to identify. And allegedly, it doesn't give police direct access to your raw DNA data. I think we should take a moment to break this down and just make sure you have a full understanding of the process, because I will admit I certainly did not before doing all this research. So the police have their DNA from the crime scene, and it's not the same as Catherine's. Therefore, they know it's their suspect's DNA. Then they send the suspect's DNA to the forensic lab, who is sending the detectives familial matches related to the suspect. And somewhere down the line, relatives who may not be an immediate family member have taken a swab from 23andMe. For example, a relative who is the suspect's great-grandmother's cousin's grandchild, and another relative over here who is the suspect's great-uncle's granddaughter. They've given their DNA. So now the police have to recreate the family tree from those familial matches. So it's not always going to be a match with an immediate family member, and there can be a lot of DNA and people in between, because you have to think about the children, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, their children, and grandchildren. right? It's a lot. So the search becomes overwhelming because the tree had just kept growing and growing. The detective's wife, who was an auto crimes detective, decided to help cipher through 7,500 names during her off time. And somehow she comes to the conclusion that all the matches are Cajun, meaning they're coming from Louisiana, and specifically Kaplan, Louisiana. And there's one name that keeps coming up, Shara LaPointe. And she was building all of these family trees. But what she was doing was she was building her family tree. And Tina had asked her, so Shara agreed to help. Tina, the detective's wife. Shara had become known as the Gene Hunter and helped identify a woman buried along Interstate Highway 45 in the Texas Killing Fields case. So whenever Tina and Shara, they needed DNA, they would tell Aaron, Tina's husband, the detective. Then Aaron and Texas Ranger Brandon would go talk to people in Texas and try to convince them to give them their DNA. They would then compare the shared DNA to the suspect. And if the amount of shared genetic material was low, then they knew it was a dead end. And there's one day that Shara comes across the name Thibodeau, which was a family line very distantly related to hers. So from the name Thibodeau, she was able to see that there was a couple in Beaumont, Texas, and they had 2 sons. Both sons attended the same high school around the same time period as Catherine and Allison. The sons' names were Clayton and Michael Foreman. And now the detectives have to figure out which one is the suspect. So detective just runs Clayton's name first, and he sees that Clayton had a prior conviction of SA. A 19-year-old woman in 1981 had reported to police that Clayton had bounded her hands and raped her. The 19-year-old woman had attended the same high school where Clayton was, at the time, a manager of the school's football team. He was convicted and was only given 3 years of probation and ordered to pay a fine. While we're talking about the 1980s, there is another important event that helps complete this puzzle. Diana, the friend that we talked about earlier, she was really close friends with Catherine and Allison. Diana had dated Clayton in high school, but he graduated 3 years earlier than her. In 1982, the two decide they want to get married and have a wedding. Diana stated that when she met him, he was so kind and had the most wonderful personality. The wedding was less than 3 months away when Diana finds out about Clayton's legal history. The signs are there, right? I think we can all collectively agree that this is the biggest red flag and sign not to marry someone. But here's the thing. Diana didn't really get much details on exactly what happened. Clayton just manipulates the situation and convinces Diana it's all just a misunderstanding. So in her mind, she's thinking, what he's telling me must be true. He's not sitting in jail. He's walking around a free man, so he must have not done it. However, Diana's family thinks differently, and her parents want her to call off the wedding. They're asking her, why don't you just wait? But she doesn't want to wait. She believes him, and she wants to get married. She loves him. So Catherine and Allison were Diana's bridesmaids at her wedding in 1982. Diana and Clayton end up staying married for a little over 11 years. And during their marriage, they have one child together. While married, Clayton lies to Diana about their finances, and ultimately, they end their marriage after he has an affair. So, looking back, she does remember that he had an obsession with police officers, and she remembers he ordered a pair of handcuffs and had them hung on the rearview mirror in his vehicle. Another red flag. She calls her ex-husband to talk about one of her friends being murdered, and his reaction? He didn't have one. They find Clayton, right? They see his history. So now the police track him down in Ohio, where he's working as an Uber driver. A detective in Ohio does a trash grab. They need DNA, so they're grabbing plastic cups, plastic silverware, really anything that might have a chance of having his DNA on it. The DNA results come back. The likelihood that the DNA belonged to Clayton Foreman was 461 septillion. So if you don't know, the large numbers go million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, then septillion. So that's 24 zeros, by the way. The chances, they really don't get any better than that. The detectives go to Ohio and lure him to the sheriff's office under the guise that someone had left a purse in his car while driving for Uber. Then they start asking him questions related to Catherine's murder, but he denies even knowing that she was murdered. He denies everything and starts asking for an attorney. The detectives let him think he's going to walk out of the station that day. But just right before he can make it to the double doors to get outside, they arrest him using the same handcuffs he had put on Catherine the night she died. On April 29th, 2021, Clayton was charged for Mary Catherine Edwards' murder. And the trial for murder began on March 12th, 2024. During the proceedings, 4 women testified against Clayton Foreman. Among them was his ex-wife, Diana, but I want to highlight the other women whose voices and stories we haven't really heard yet. In 1980, the legal drinking age was 19. Around 9 p.m. one rainy evening, Paula left a local Western-themed country bar. While attempting to drive away, her car became stuck in a ditch. She got out, she slipped and fell, but managed to make her way across the street to a gas station to call her mother from a payphone. As Paula approached the phone, a man named Clayton sat in his car with the window down. He asked her what she was doing, and she explained that her car was stuck in a ditch. Clayton then asked Paula if she knew his brother Mike, likely assuming she might recognize the name since many in the area attended Forest Park schools. Paula, she confirms, she's like, yeah, I know Mike. During their conversation, Clayton claimed to be a policeman and offered to give her a ride home. Trusting him, Paula got into the passenger seat of his car. She began directing him to her house, pointing out landmarks and saying things like, you go here and you go here, when suddenly she realized they weren't anywhere that she knew. Clayton had driven her to a secluded field. Paula described an overwhelming sense of dread as she noticed a sudden change in his demeanor. She was too scared to say anything, overcome with fear and confusion, and she began to cry. Clayton angrily told her to stop crying and shut up. He reached into his glove box, pulled out what he claimed was a switchblade, and forced her into the backseat of the car. He tied her hands behind her back with a belt and threatened to cut her throat if she didn't comply. Clayton then assaulted her. During the ordeal, Paula fixated on the light from a nearby billboard, trying to just dissociate from what was happening and trying to survive. Afterward, he drove her home, and before she got out of the car, he says 3 things. Stop crying. I'm sorry. And I hope I didn't hurt you. Paula didn't tell anyone immediately. She carried the weight of shame and fear, waiting about a week and a half before confiding in a close friend. Her friend, realizing the gravity of what happened, contacted the police. Shortly after, the police reached out to Paula and told her, "We think you need to come in." Paula also had no idea her friend had called. And Paula was very brave to get in court and share her story 40-something years later. I'll insert a clip here, but you can tell she's distraught. She's having to relive those emotions again.
At some point, did you realize you weren't going to your house?
Yes.
What were your feelings at that particular time?
Just scared, confused.
This is 40-something years ago, and you're still shaking. Where did he drive you?
I don't.
Was it a road or was it in the middle of a field?
It was a field. Thank you. It was a field.
When you pulled up in the pasture or the field, what were you feeling?
Dread.
At that point, did the defendant's demeanor start changing?
Yes.
How so?
He's mean.
Started getting mean.
Yes, sir.
Did he tell you anything when you started crying?
Yeah, to stop and to shut up.
Did he reach over into the glove compartment?
Yes.
What did he get out of the glove compartment?
He told me it was a switchblade. It was a knife.
Did it look like a switchblade?
Yes.
Did he threaten you with that switchblade?
Yes.
When he got to the back, what did he do?
Well, first he tied my hands back.
He tied your hands behind your back?
Yes.
You remember what he tied your hands behind your back
It was
with?
like a belt.
A belt. Did he threaten to cut your throat if you didn't comply?
Yes.
So did you comply?
I did.
Were you crying?
I was.
Were you terrified?
I was.
What's the first thing he made you do to him? I'm sorry. I'm really sorry, Paula.
I'm sorry.
It was incredibly brave for her. And there's one point where, they ask her, "You're not doing this for yourself." And she says, "No." And they say, "Who are you doing this for?" And she says, "Catherine." Another victim who testified, Teresa. She lived in Ohio and was Clayton's fiance at the time of his arrest. She testified about her relationship with Clayton and really the troubling discoveries that she made during their time together. She recalled suggesting that they participate in a DNA testing project through National Geographic, which provided ancestry results tracing migration patterns of ancient ancestors. And the test would really only tell you any relatives only if those relatives were famous. However, Clayton strongly refused, stating he didn't want his information shared. He didn't want people to have his personal information. He claimed that that's how people and bill collectors track you down. An excuse that Teresa found odd because her career began as a bill collector. And she even clarified that even today, bill collectors do not use your DNA to track you down. During their relationship, Teresa discovered photos of young girls on Clayton's tablet. She noted that these were school photos. She believed that the children were likely daughters of his friends. When she confronted him, his initial explanation was that they were just photos that his friend sent to him. But despite his gaslighting and manipulation, Teresa couldn't shake that terrible gut feeling. She says, "When I have that gut feeling, I have a tendency to just not let things go." Eventually, Clayton admitted he kept the photos because he used them to fantasize. This is an admission that rightfully disturbed her. She had learned about Clayton's criminal history, and when she confronted him about it, he claimed, "It's all just a misunderstanding. And, we were both drunk, and she falsely accused me. I didn't rape her." When asked if she noticed anything unusual about Clayton's behaviors or maybe some interest, Teresa mentioned his fascination with police. He seemed really interested in badges and would even save pictures of badges. He would tell her stories about going on these ride-alongs with his police friends, which I'm kind of feeling it's not true, but who knows. Christy, a former coworker from Ohio, worked with Clayton at Universal Fidelity from 2008 to 2009 in debt collections, which is also odd why he said debt collectors use the DNA to track you down, because he worked in it. So Clayton was her supervisor during that time. She recalled one unsettling incident during a performance review in his office. So she's sitting in there and he's trying to find her paper, and of course, it's not ready. And while he's searching through a drawer for her file, Christine noticed he has a pair of handcuffs sitting inside. This struck her as odd since their job only involved making phone calls to collect payments. There's really not any use for them. And she recalls another time where they're in a meeting room and he doesn't have the document that he needs and asks her to go to his desk and get it out. And while she's looking, she opens the drawer and the handcuffs are sitting on top of the paper. At the time, it didn't strike her as alarming, but I'm sure, she said strange, but I'm sure it was just, well, that's weird. He's just weird kind of situation. Another moment that stood out to her happened while she, Clayton, and a few others were waiting for a coworker they were carpooling with to finish up their phone call so they could go. And someone made a joke about nuns hitting desks with rollers, and Clayton chimes in saying, "Why are they always called Mary Catherine?" Or something like that. It's always Mary Catherine. On Wednesday, March 20th, 2024, after less than an hour of jury deliberation, 63-year-old Clayton Foreman was found guilty of capital murder. He is expected to be eligible for parole after serving 30 years in prison, which would make him 93 years old. And that's where I'll leave this case. What are your thoughts on Clayton's conviction, testimonies that came to light during the trial? Do you think justice was served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you so much for joining me again on another episode. Don't forget to tune in every Tuesday for a new one. Stay safe, stay curious, and I will see you next week.